Erin, there we go. Awesome. We are off and running. Happy Friday. How has the week been for you?
Thank you. Happy Friday. All is well over here. Thank you.
Yes, dealing with the joys of a New England transition from winter to spring and trying to figure out 40-degree weather bumps, it sounds like.
Exactly. It's making it a little tricky to plan my garden, so I need the
Ooh.
weather to even out a little bit for me, but hopefully New England will work with me.
Yeah, that's tough. My wife and I, okay, I say my wife and I, that's not true. My wife planted uh, our garden probably about a month ago now, and it has been thriving. The thing about Knoxville that's great is it's a relatively like temperate climate. It doesn't get super hot and doesn't get super cold, and it's like gives you enough humidity and moisture that things really thrive. But yeah, we've kind of hit the first hurdle right now. A couple of things are not thriving as much as we think they should be, so we're trying to figure out, okay, like it's just like this never-ending problem-solving loop. It's like, do they get enough water? Is it not enough water? Like, is it a soil thing? Like, why is this thing not growing anymore? But
Yeah, so much detective work.
it really is. I'm like, the fact that people grow so much food is mind blowing to me. Like, if you were a farmer and you do that full time, like, hats off to you because it's incredible.
I know. Really, really complex stuff. You really got to know what you're doing to do it well. It's super interesting.
I know it is absolutely fascinating. But we're not here today to talk about farming, although that would be a really good podcast episode at some point in the future because I think people should be making an effort to grow more of their own food and produce just so they know where it comes from. I think it's a good thing, a good habit to get into moving forward in life. However, today we're going to be talking about some more basic nutrition questions. But before we dive into the episode, I would love if you could give people just a quick rundown on who you are, what you do. And then we can also introduce you as Rebel Performance's nutrition coach, which we are so amped and excited for. That's one thing that we've had so many requests for. And yeah, we're just so thrilled to have you on the team. But yeah, if you could give the quick elevator pitch on who you are and what you do, and then we'll dive in and start talking some quantity quality things.
Perfect. Yes. So my background is I have my Master's of Science in Nutrition Research, plus my didactic program in dietetics. My boards for my medical license to be a dietitian is actually in 2 weeks. But I've been a nutritionist and a nutrition coach for probably about 5 years now. And before that, I was a personal trainer and CrossFit coach. So I've been working with clients for about 8 or 9 years now. And then I'm also a research assistant. So I research, see people, and I used to be in a hospital a lot. So I'm out of the hospital setting. So really kind of every shade of nutrition is what I work with, and especially work with humans and their nutrition. So that's the big focus of my life and my work.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, it was funny when we started talking at Rebel about bringing on a nutrition coach, and I was just kind of like floating ideas out to people. And it was like, hey, if you were going to hire one person, who would it be? And it was like, you were the name that I kept getting from people. And I was like, all right, cool. Well, it's clearly got to be Erin. And then like the more we chatted, I was like, oh, this is a no brainer. I was like, it's kind of that analogy, right? Of like, you want to be 10 feet wide and 10 feet tall. And I feel like that's what you bring to the table and why I'm so excited to have you on board. Because I think some people, and you see this a lot in academia, like when I was in grad school, you see this where you see people who are really tall but super narrow. It's like once you get outside this like little narrow specialty, they don't really everything falls apart really rapidly. And I appreciate that from a research standpoint, but when we're actually trying to coach humans, it's hard to be really successful if you have a very narrow operating range, right? We want a very wide operating range and we want one that's very tall as well. So we can help the most people in the most ways be super successful. And then the topic today that I would like to focus on, because nutrition is such a big one, but I think a question that we have been getting that I have gotten is people are trying to figure out where to start, right? Whether it's trying to gain weight or whether it's trying to lose weight. That's generally one of the two directions people are trying to move in. And the question that I get a lot of times is like, well, when I'm starting this, should I be focusing more on food quantity or on food quality? Should I be focusing on both? Because we know how hard behavior changes for people. And I think if we could get some clarity on like order or hierarchy of demands, right? Like let's focus on getting this in place first. Once this is in place, then let's focus on this so we can actually put you in a position to be really successful. Because if you try to change everything at once, you're not going to change anything and nothing's going to happen. And that's a lose-lose, right? So we got to pick like from a starting point standpoint, do you like to focus on just quantity first and then transition to quality, or kind of walk me through your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot in there. So I would say it's really kind of a whole, when I view people and their nutrition, I really view it as this huge constellation, because there's the food itself. So I think of their nutrition biochemistry and their physiology, but then there's really also this other side of the house that I think can't be understated, which is what I call food behavior. And for some folks, some of those food behavior items are going to be primary pieces that we need to look at first. But then also, we can't ignore the food itself. So, if someone is having a food relationship issue, food is being used in certain ways that aren't serving their health or their goals. That usually is something to soften and shift around first, so that then they can actually get things from their nutrition. And the way I kind of frame that in my brain is, there's really, and this is kind of the biggest conundrum of nutrition, there's so much wonderful research. We know actually a lot about the way food is used in our bodies. We don't know everything, but we have really strong bodies of evidence for a multitude of different components of our nutrition in our bodies and how those work in terms of performance, but recovery and longevity and inflammation and all these wonderful things of our physiology. But if we can't access those tools because an individual isn't in a place to be able to apply those principles, because there's something going on in their food behavior and in their goal setting and things like that, that's going to be a primary thing to noodle around with first. That's got to be retooled so that then they can access nutrition science. And that to me is one of the reasons why I think behavior and behavior change is so key, because I love our science. There's all this awesome stuff to use, but for a lot of people, it's just sitting there on the shelf and not accessible. So I would say for a lot of folks, we just need to make sure that they've built some healthy behaviors around food, because that really could be the biggest rock. So we have to start with the lowest hanging fruit there with some of that. And then we can start looking at that quantity factor. But quantity and quality can kind of web in and out of one another, because for some people, the quality is an issue that alters consumption, because some foods are so hard to regulate. So in some senses, we can hit the quantity by hitting the quality, depending on where someone's baseline diet is. But no doubt, the biggest thing, the bottom of the pyramid of what is occurring in someone's nutrition, is definitely energy balance. So in that regard, just from the numeric side of things, from that biochem side of things, quantity is going to be key, because that will determine everything: energy stores, energy availability, muscle, fat tissue, all those things. So we can kind of work through those in a few different ways depending on the individual. But for a lot of people, thankfully, a lot of those things actually do work well, nicely together, so they can hit a few things at once.
Yeah, I think that it is really important, as you mentioned, that this is nuanced, right? Like when we're talking about nutrition, we are ultimately talking about human behavior. And there's a whole lot that goes on here. I think the idea of a constellation makes a lot of sense to me. I love that analogy, because I think sometimes people go on the internet or they go on social media and they hear this very dogmatic, very simple approach to nutrition. It's like, oh, well, you need to do keto, or you need to do carnivore, you need to do paleo, you need to do, like, no one ever talks about Mediterranean anymore, but like 10 years ago, it's like, oh, you got to do Mediterranean, or you got to do Atkins, or you got to do Zone. And it's like, everybody loves to take nutrition and just like put a label on it and call it their own thing. And it's like, well, at the end of the day, it's food. Like we're just talking about different ways to consume food to put you in a position to be really successful, whether it's hitting your strength goals, your physique goals, your performance goals, your health goals, your longevity goals, whatever it's going to be, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things to get across here. And what I love about your approach and what you're doing is, like, we're not trying to, force you down a particular path, because I think that there are people out there that do that. Like, it's a very restrictive approach. Like, oh, you've got to do it this way. But I think in the nutrition realm, what's important to consider is that there are so many ways and options for you to be really successful here. It's really more about kind of like molding that clay and figuring out the person in question and like their habits and their lifestyle and what they're struggling with and what their goals are. Like, what's their schedule look like on a day-to-day basis? It's like, are they married? Do they have kids? Like, what's going on in the house? How about at job, at work? And it's, you have to really mold it to that person in front of you and figure out like, what is it that they need to be really successful?
Absolutely. And in that regard, too, to your point, I feel like there's a lot of things that look really little or low level that just get completely missed and their potency is poorly understood. So for something as simple as, are you eating, or if you're someone who's lifting, for example, if we have a client who's training and they're aiming to put on muscle and they're working really hard, and we look at, are you eating protein pulses throughout the day with highly bioavailable complete amino acid profiles? Many athletes, it's like, well, no, I didn't have lunch today. And that's okay, but like actually that does matter. Or are you someone who eats so fast because you're underfed during the day, or you eat while you're watching TV, and then you're not even kind of regulating the meal with all of the components of your nervous system that should be able to regulate that meal because you're watching a show or whatever it might be, and then you're eating really fast and not enjoying things, and then you have an upset stomach. And honestly, a lot of people are really fast and distracted eaters, and it completely changes their calorie intake and their digestion. Or are we eating out from home all the time because we don't have some basic cooking skills? And people, I'm sure it's tempting to say, especially as you mentioned, because we want to do all these things at once. People might think, Erin, I got to learn to cook a little bit, or I got to get better about lunch, or you want me to eat slower? Like, really? But I'm thinking you would be amazed if you actually did that. They seem so small that we think, yeah, I can do that. And then we look at it and we look at, did I actually do that? Am I doing that? And then often we're not. And actually, all those little things come together and just matter so much, and they can be really potent. So, in that regard, too, all those little behavior things can serve a higher purpose when they're strung together and truly executed.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think people always overlook the things at the like the simple things at the bottom of the pyramid, the foundational elements. But at the end of the day, like people I think would be amazed at how the small changes are the ones that actually the small simple changes are the ones that are going to give you the biggest return on investment and get you the biggest change. All the super fancy stuff that everybody wants to talk about on the internet, that's like the sprinkle on the icing on like the cake on the whole thing here, right? But everybody jumps to those really flashy things because for some reason it's sexy and they think it's going to really help them a lot. But they're totally missing all of these just really big rock foundational things like you mentioned. And yeah, I think, you know, the whole James Clear thing with atomic habits, right? Like small changes are what lead to massive outcome differences. It's just the consistency of small changes over time and the compounding effect and being able to get people to focus on those things. I think like missing lunch is a huge one, right? It's like, I think about myself, I hate lunch. Lunch is like the worst meal of the day. It's so obnoxious. It's right in the middle. Like I don't want to stop what I'm doing. It's such a pain in the ass. But like at the end of the day, I think about myself and the people listening to this. It's, if you're here listening to this, I'm going to assume that you are what I would categorize as a high output human. It's like you show up and the gas pedal is down pretty much in every aspect of your life, your profession, your family, your relationships, your friends, definitely your training, your active lifestyle. It's like you are a high output human. And I think about myself, and it's like, if I miss lunch, there's just no way for me to make that up anywhere. It's like, I'm not going to be able just to double down at dinner or like throw more food in at the end of the day. It's like, I'm going to be off. I will be under by at least 500 calories come the end of the day if I miss something as simple as lunch.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
But like people don't want to have that conversation or look at that for some reason. And the way I like to talk about nutrition with folk, I think, is that like, why would you show up and work so hard in every other aspect of your life if you're not going to get this most core foundational bit in place? Because it's the thing that's going to fuel and give you the capacity to actually be good at all these other things, right? Like if the nutrition's not there, all the training and everything else you're doing is frankly kind of it's not a waste of time, but I like to use the analogy of you're pretty much trying to dig a hole in super loose sand, right? I don't know like if people listening have ever done this, but if you go to dig a hole in really, really loose sand, you shovel it out, put it in the wheelbarrow. By the time you turn around, 80 to 90% of the sand has fallen back into the hole. And when you're just overlooking these core nutritional components, that's essentially what you're doing to yourself. You're working really, really, really hard at every other aspect of your life just to let 80 to 90% of the sand continue to fall back in the hole. And I'm like, I just don't understand why we would do it that way.
I know, absolutely. And with nutrition too, like I always tell my clients, this is not a science of a Hail Mary. You need to throw a 10-yard pass every single day for honestly a couple years. And then let's see how things are going. Not to be dramatic, but it's very similar with lifting. Like, oh, I've lifted for a few weeks. I don't see any difference. It's so tempting to get caught up in that. And nutrition is the same way. But when we really look at our physiology, and this is actually also a good thing about food, I always tell people food is slow. You can be in a virtuous cycle for many, many years, or you can be in a vicious cycle for many, many years. And over all those years, we can build an animal or we can build a disease. And that is the nature of food. So we have to kind of get on our body's clock rather than our culture of immediacy and realize that this science has to be thought of just very differently than the way our culture thinks of it. And I think that's where people, even high level athletes, can get really stuck. We want that good, quick stuff without looking at those little things and really, really executing every day. But in that way, it's a catch-22 because that's actually a little bit more pleasant than going on some wacky diet that we can barely maintain. So there's also an opportunity there for something a lot more peaceful that's actually more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that analogy. It's like be the Tom Brady of nutrition. Like Tom Brady has not made a career throwing Hail Marys. He had 1 year, he had Randy Moss, and he threw a lot of deep balls. I'll give him that. The rest of his outrageously long career has been made throwing 5-yard passes and completing them at a very high rate. Like, let's be honest. He's the king of the 5 to 10-yard pass. Do the same thing with your nutrition.
Absolutely.
Because I think that,
yes.
And again, I'll reference that Atomic Habits book by James Clear. I think it's just so good. And he has a graph in there showing a convex curve, right? And he's talking about habit formation or anything along these lines. And so if you're on a convex curve, right, like the front part of that curve is very flat. Like you're doing something, but you're not really seeing much change. And so like you have to get to this inflection point where those small habits and daily actions get you onto the upward portion of that growth curve. And now we're off and running and you're reaping the benefits of the fact that you've been doing this thing. But so many people give up early on because they're on the flat part of the curve and they're not seeing this drastic change. But it's like, man, if you could just forecast yourself out 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. If you can just keep doing this thing, like you would be so amazed at where you'll be in 1, 3, 5, 10 years, right? I think that's one of the things we start to talk about with our people a lot is, you know, when you come on board in Rebel, yeah, we want to get you as much progress and as many results as we can in 16 weeks. But it's not really about the 16 weeks. It's about teaching you and showing you what you need to be super successful for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. Because that's where the compounding effect comes in. And that's what we're chasing. And that's where something as simple to bring this kind of back to where we started is just making sure that your food quantity is right, that you're not missing meals, or that you're not putting yourself in a position to where you're just like way overeating. I think you can kind of have like that swing in both directions, right? It's like you have the person trying to gain weight that just misses lunch 3 times a week, or you have the person that's trying to lose weight and they're super restrictive. And then the end of the day comes and they're starving and they just come home and it's like whatever they can find in the cabinets is good. There's like chips, ice cream, whole gallon chocolate milk, like whatever it is. It's like, we're just going to binge eat all that because I've been super restrictive throughout the day. And that quantity component, while not sexy, that's one of the biggest rocks. Like we got to make sure we're getting that right and consistently getting it right. It's not about getting it right for one day. It's about learning how to get it right all week, all month, all quarter, all like half year, all year. That's what we're chasing here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And with that way that we tend to approach nutrition like that, food anyways has this interesting nature to it that's very exteroceptive. So it really can connect with those seeking behaviors in us and some of that dopaminergic behavior that we all have deeply wired in here. And it's very, very exteroceptive, which actually poses a little bit of a challenge from the outset when we have a nutrition goal, because there's this thing outside of me that I need to keep using the right way. And I'm really thinking of this thing that I want down the line. So for weight loss, for example, we have these, as you know, we have all these outcome goals. I want to lose 10 pounds. I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to look leaner. I want to whatever. Very, very long-term outcome based. And there's really this massive journey between where we are now and that outcome. And food already is exteroceptive. So a big task that I like to get my clients into is actually becoming a much more process-driven person that's enjoying their food and interacting with their food and having some fun with their food, like maybe planting a tomato plant and cooking a little bit more at home and trying some new recipes. Or I was even just talking with a client yesterday whose friends really like to go out. And she kind of ends up at restaurants and bars and all these things. And we talked about we might even want to shift some of our social situation. How about we start inviting friends over for dinner and we ask everybody to bring a dish? Like, let's start interacting with food a little differently so that we're a little bit more process driven. And then all these really interesting details, like how we're eating and how much we're eating, understanding that quantity, where food is coming from, then the quality of the food. It becomes easier to embrace those details when we shift out of that very exteroceptive, reward seeking based outcome goal. And we realize there's actually this process that I need to drop into and cultivate. And good things will keep coming from that, just as they will with my training.
For sure. For sure. It's like, I think sometimes people get so obsessed with the goal, and it's not even really about the goal. Because the thing with goals are like, once you get to the goal, you've already essentially moved on and established whatever the next goal is going to be, right? It's like, once you climb this mountain, you're already thinking about, okay, well, let's like look at this next hill I need to get to. The only reason that we have goals is so we can backtrack and establish what the daily actions and habits are to be the type of person that does this thing consistently, so that it'll actually get you to that goal, right? But it's not about the goal. It's about what are the actions and habits that I have to do consistently that are going to make me the type of person that will then inevitably reach this goal. And so I think like the distinction between those two extremes are really important, because sometimes people become way too goal oriented, but they need to be process oriented, because you can't achieve a goal without the process, right? It's like the only reason I set a goal is so I can establish the process needed to then get to that goal. But I think people sometimes get those two worlds flipped, and it makes things really, really difficult for themselves.
Absolutely. And that's actually kind of a funky thing that I try to work around with my clients. When I ask people what they want to achieve, I actually don't say that. I don't say, what do you want from your nutrition? I ask people, and we've been talking about this with our Rebel clients as well. I've asked people, tell me about the version of you that you want to build. What does he look like? What does he do? What's his day like? What's different about him? And the reason I think of that is I view us all as having many, many versions of us. Like grad school Erin was very different than Erin now, and high school Erin, and probably where I am next year. There's these very different versions of Erin that have different amounts of muscle on her body, that's eating differently. There's different sleep and wake routines. Erin at the hospital all day is very different than Erin who has time to lift during the day. And so I think of these versions, and I try to remind my clients, we want to honor and respect all these different versions of us. But if we want something different, we will have to be different. So the version of Erin that perhaps has more muscle or is doing something different with food, she's going to have a different day. She's going to have different behaviors. And for some people, even if you want that healthy relationship with food or body recomposition, how does that version of you think about food, use food, interact with food, shop for food? Her day and her week will be different. So instead of thinking of, I just want to lose 10 pounds, I really want to think of what's the version of me that has more muscle, that has this relationship with food that I want, that eats different quantities of food. Because that way we're thinking in these processes and we're thinking in behaviors and practices. And so in that regard, I don't ask people, what do you want to achieve? I ask them about the version of them they want to become, because then we start getting our brain on board with those details.
For sure. For sure. I love that. And so for people listening to this right now who are kind of like, guys, this all sounds great, but what really small first step can I take for myself and implement on my own? Like, what would you tell somebody, right? If they're listening to this podcast, they're like, all this sounds amazing, but like, if I want to try doing this for myself a little bit, like, where's the first place I should focus? What's that very first small step that I should take, right? Is it just like, let's get online, use like a calorie calculator. There's a bazillion of them. They're not hard to find. Just figure out, okay, here's generally how many calories I need to be eating. And then here's generally how that breaks down into macros. Like, maybe I should just put all my focus on like that first small step of just trying to hit these numbers consistently. I didn't know if you would have a tip or recommendation on what's that first small step that someone can take if they really want to try to do this on their own.
So there's really a number of ways you can tackle this, but one very good 30,000 foot view place to begin, notoriously with nutrition, is actually the first hurdle we tend to have. Even in our big studies, we have these huge hurdles of what we'll call misreporting. And it's not to say that people are bad people, or that they're intentionally lying. But with nutrition, we have this, it's almost funny. We all do it. Even they'll actually do research on dietitians and they're still misreporting by about 10%. We have this problem in nutrition where, and I believe in our health behaviors in general, where we're not always truly aware of what the heck we're doing. And in nutrition research, we have a common value where people are misreporting nutrition and data and health behavior by about 30 to 60%. That, which is to say, my participants in my study report their total calorie intake, they might be off by 30 to 60%. That is a lot. That is not a reliable value. And so in that regard, one of the first things I do with almost any client is start tuning in and auditing one's day. We might think, yeah, I eat vegetables, but do you? And how many? And how much protein do you really eat? And yeah, I think I get enough sleep. Okay, when are you literally going to bed? Are you actually sleeping well? And then it's like, well, I am on TikTok for an hour and then I don't put my phone down till 11 and I did miss lunch today and which is okay. But we just need to know that because we need to know what your body's really getting right now. And then that helps us make a game plan for priorities. So when it comes to specific nutritional intake, I really challenge people because it's not easy. Tune in fully to what you're getting. So one place to begin can be to track in something like Chronometer or even with food photos or flexible macros and really look at what is your body getting at baseline right now. Because what our physiology is at this very moment is the lagging result of what we've been doing for the past year. So let's see what we're getting. And then if, depending on what your goal is, if you want to gain muscle or something, we're going to have to look at then increasing protein, increasing lifting. Are you even lifting enough would be a question. So really auditing your health life is where I would first begin to get a very, very good, accurate picture on what your body's actually getting.
I love that. I think that's perfect. What gets measured gets managed. And if the measurement is trash, then there's nothing to manage.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, like, it's data. Like, guys and girls
Got to be a
listening,
good scientist. You got
it's
to
just
start
data.
there.
Like, yeah, like, I don't know if there's anything more important in your life than your own health and well-being. So if you're going to show up for something, please do not fudge this. Like, it's not that hard. Like, these numbers are very concrete. It's like you have a little scale and it's going to tell you exactly how much this thing weighs. And you just put that exact weight into whatever food tracker maybe you're using, or you're just keeping a log by day. It's like, what time do you go to bed? What time do you wake up? And like, don't fudge that. Just be like super honest, right? It's just the math doesn't lie unless you make it lie. But yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that was the absolute best place for people to start, is just get really good at tracking what you're actually doing so you understand where you are, because you can't know what needs to change unless you know where you currently are with as much accuracy and validity as we can possibly have.
100%. And exactly what you said. I tell people it's a good thing to make sense. If you're telling me you eat 1 egg per day and you're not losing even a half pound per week, I'm sending you to the hospital. It is actually okay to say, you know what, I'm not quite where I want to be. I haven't had any, muscle gain. I'm kind of feeling like crap. That's okay. Let's get data on that because that means there's something you can do about it. So it's a very, very good thing to make sense. So it's okay if your data is a little funky and you're thinking, man, I have a few areas of opportunity here. That's awesome. That gives you a really good track. And it means that you and your body both make sense, which I would wager is usually the case. Your body's not bad. Your body's not producing muscle for no reason or whatever the goal might be. Our body responds to stimuli. So we just need to be really clear about that. And then you know that you actually have an internal locus of control for creating some of those shifts.
I think the mindset shift on what you just said is super important for people, because I think sometimes when they start to track, especially the perfectionists in the crowd, it's like they get deterred from tracking because they're like, oh my God, like this is so bad. And they start to like manipulate the data because they're like, well, this is probably what it more like this is more right. Right. Because people get into this rhythm of our entire life. We're like rewarded and told like, oh, well, you know, we're going to be in school and you're going to study all this stuff. And then you're going to go take a test. And we want you to get A's on these tests, like these random things that we've created to judge whether or not you're good at this subject, blah, 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 blah. And so it's like when people start to track and measure this for themselves, it's like, oh my God, I'm not passing the test, but I'm going to fudge this to make sure that I am passing the test. And then my brain's like, oh, see, everything's fine. But at the end of the day, the way that you phrase it is perfect. It's like, if you're not moving towards your goals and you start tracking really accurately, that's amazing, because like it's not a deficiency. Like you're not failing the test. You're finding incredible opportunities for improvement, right? Because it would suck if like you're not moving in the right direction and you're doing all the right things. It's like, okay, like that sucks. That's not fun, right? That's like I'd studied my ass off and did everything I could and still got a C on the test. Like sometimes it just is what it is. But like if you're not moving in the right direction and you track accurately and you're seeing all these places that are off, that should be super exciting to you, because that's a huge opportunity for improvement. It's not a failure. I think that mindset shift for people is like critically important when doing this type of work.
Absolutely. And that is where many of us will hit our first hurdle. So be prepared to find some things that maybe don't feel awesome and just realize that's data. That's just data. I make some of my clients even say we have to shift out of like failed, good, bad, all those things. And I make some of my clients say, that was just data. That's just data. Then you can use data. So for those of you who that is a big hurdle, I really urge you to shift into a little bit more of a scientist's brain instead of just being a judge. Just really be a scientist, not a judge.
Excellent. Well, Erin, this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could just kind of keep this going all day if we really wanted to, but I feel like this was really good. This was a nice, jam-packed 30 minutes for folks with lots of nuggets and takeaways. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed the conversation. But Erin, thank you so much for coming on. Again, we are so amped to have you on the Rebel team. We are so fortunate. And if people wanted to go find you, where would be the best place for them to go just kind of follow along with all the things that you are doing?
So my Instagram handle is Erin's Uncommon Eats, and kind of everything branches out from there. All my info for you, how you can contact me, is on there. And then my food blog is on there. And then a lot of my posts, I try to do a lot of nutrition science and behavior change stuff to be helpful. So it's mostly all on there.
Perfect. Well, go drop Erin a follow and keep up with what she's doing, because she's fantastic. And everybody have a beautiful rest of your week. We'll talk to you soon. Later, y'all.
Thank you.